The first thing my father saw was the soup running down my face. Not the man who had poured it over my head. Not the stunned silence that had swallowed the dining room. Not the way every fork had frozen halfway to every mouth in that polished Charleston restaurant. What he saw was me, 52 years old, standing there in a cream-colored blouse now stained with tomato bisque, drawing attention to the Reeves family table. And the first words out of his mouth were, "Abigail, sit down, you're embarrassing us." Even now, thinking back on that moment, I can still hear the soft clink of silverware, the low jazz humming from hidden speakers, the smell of fresh bread and basil hanging in the air. And I remember thinking something I never expected to think about my own father. He would rather see me humiliated than inconvenience a stranger. The man standing over me was named Derek Mercer. At the time, I knew him only as one of my younger brother Caleb's business associates, the sort of man Charleston produced in steady supply these days. Expensive loafers, bright white teeth, hair too carefully messy to be accidental. The kind of man who mistook confidence for character. He was smiling when he dumped the soup over my head. "Look at her," he'd announced loudly enough for half the room to hear, too scared to fight back. A few people laughed. Not because it was funny. Because weak people often laugh when cruelty enters the room. They think it protects them from becoming the next target. I slowly reached for my napkin and dabbed at my face. Across the table, my younger brother Caleb smirked into his bourbon glass. Mother looked horrified, but not for me. For the scene. And Father? Father wouldn't even meet my eyes. I looked at him anyway. After all these years, some part of me still expected him to become the man I had needed when I was 16, or 22, or 35. A man who might say, "That's my daughter, show some respect." Instead, he leaned slightly toward me and whispered through clenched teeth, "Be quiet, don't make this worse." Something inside me became very still. Not broken. Not angry. Just still. The kind of stillness I'd learned years ago in places far more dangerous than this restaurant. The kind that comes just before action. I reached up, lifted the soup bowl from where Derek had dropped it crookedly against my shoulder, and placed it carefully on the table. Then I stood. Derek straightened a little surprised. He'd expected tears, maybe shouting, maybe some dramatic reaction he could mock later over drinks. Instead, I looked him directly in the eye and knocked the bowl onto the hardwood floor. It shattered. The crack echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Then I said very calmly, "You've made a serious mistake." His smile faltered. Only for a second. Then he laughed again. "Oh yeah, you gonna call your lawyer?" I held his gaze for another moment. "No," I said. Then I turned and walked out. No shouting. No threats. No explanations. Just silence. That unsettled him more than any outburst could have. I knew because I heard him call after me as I crossed the dining room. "Yeah, that's right, walk away." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Outside, Charleston's evening air was warm and smelled faintly of salt drifting in from the harbor. I stood beneath the restaurant awning and let the humid breeze dry the soup on my skin. For a long moment, I simply breathed. People often imagine restraint as weakness. They imagine that if you do not strike back immediately, you are afraid. They have no understanding of what real discipline costs. At 52, I had spent more than half my life mastering that discipline. 28 years in naval service had taught me many things. How to endure pain without complaint. How to assess threats quickly. How to keep my voice steady when chaos pressed in from every side. How to wait. Waiting properly done is one of the most powerful acts a person can perform. A black sedan idled across the street. The driver stepped out the moment he saw me. "Commander Reeves?" "Evening, Harris." His eyes flicked to the soup staining my blouse. His jaw tightened. What happened? Nothing requiring intervention. He knew better than to press. He opened the rear door and I slid inside. As Charleston's old brick buildings drifted past the window, I thought about my father. About all the years he'd spent disappointed that his eldest child had not become what he considered respectable. He'd wanted country clubs, law school, marriage to some polished Charleston attorney. Not military service. Certainly not naval special warfare. The truth was neither he nor mother had ever understood what I actually did. Security clearances made detailed explanations impossible. So they had built their own assumptions. To them, I was still the difficult daughter who had run away to join the Navy. And Caleb, charming local visible Caleb, was success incarnate. I had long ago stopped trying to correct them. But tonight felt different. Because this time their silence had not merely disappointed me. It had revealed them. As the sedan turned toward the harbor district, my secure phone vibrated. One message. From Admiral Thomas Whitaker. Saw the incident, call me immediately. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge. Because Derek Mercer had no idea what kind of attention he had just attracted. And in exactly 1 week he was going to learn who Abigail Reeves really was. By the time I returned Admiral Whitaker's call, the city lights of Charleston had become scattered gold across the harbor water. Harris drove in silence as he always did, his attention fixed on the road. He had worked with me for nearly 4 years and understood that quiet was often more useful than conversation. The phone rang only once before Whitaker answered. Abigail. His voice carried that same steady authority I had first heard 23 years earlier, when he was Captain Whitaker, and I was a young lieutenant trying very hard not to look terrified during my first operational briefing. Sir, I take it you're all right. I'm fine. A pause. Then his tone sharpened. What happened tonight was unacceptable. I glanced through the tinted window at the familiar Charleston streets. Nothing had changed here. The old oak trees still draped their branches over the roads. The gas lanterns still glowed outside historic homes. The same families still traded the same polite smiles over the same old judgments. And somehow, all these years later, I still became 17 again whenever my father looked disappointed. It was a drunken fool trying to impress a room full of strangers, I said. That fool assaulted a senior naval special warfare commander in public. His words were matter of fact. Not emotional. Not angry. Simply true. I assume there's footage. The restaurant has already preserved security video. Of course they had. Charleston might be old-fashioned in manners, but every establishment worth its reputation had modern surveillance. I'm not interested in making this bigger than necessary. Whitaker gave a quiet breath that might have been amusement. That decision may no longer be yours. I knew what he meant. Once certain lines were crossed, procedure took over. A public assault against someone in my position created complications far beyond personal insult. Security concerns, federal review, questions about motive access and vulnerability. The kind of things Washington took seriously whether I wanted it or not. Still, I said only understood. After we ended the call, I leaned back and closed my eyes. And as often happens when the present becomes too heavy, memory pulled me backward. I was 18 again, standing in my parents' kitchen in our old brick house on Trad Street. My acceptance papers from Annapolis sat folded in my hands. Mother was crying softly at the sink. Father stood by the window staring out at the garden. You'll throw your life away, he said. Not loudly. That was never his way. Disappointment delivered softly can cut deeper than rage. I've made my decision. He turned, then his expression calm and distant. The Navy is for people who have no better options. That sentence stayed with me for years, not because it hurt, because it clarified everything. I understood in that moment that if I stayed in Charleston and built the life my father approved of, I would never know whether I had been capable of more. So I left. And I never looked back. Annapolis nearly broke me. The first year was a blur of exhaustion and failure, and learning that discipline matters more than talent. The men underestimated me immediately. A Southern girl with careful manners and good posture did not fit their assumptions of toughness. I let them underestimate me. That became a habit. Then BUD/S nearly killed me. People love talking about Navy SEAL training as though it's some kind of action movie spectacle. Mostly it's cold. Relentless, bone-deep cold. And fatigue so profound your mind starts inventing reasons to quit. The instructors never needed to scream much. Your own thoughts did that work for them. I survived because I discovered something simple. Pain always ends. But regret has no expiration date. When Hell Week was over, I weighed 11 pounds less and looked 10 years older. And for the first time in my life, I felt fully myself. Years passed. Assignments accumulated. Leadership came gradually. Then suddenly, Afghanistan. The Horn of Africa. Joint operations too classified to discuss even now. Promotions. Responsibility. Losses I still carry. Eventually command. Eventually Washington. Eventually the kind of clearance that meant even my own family could know almost nothing about what I actually did. So when Mother asked what I was working on, I would say administrative operations. When Father asked if I was ever planning to settle down and do something stable, I would smile and say, I'm exactly where I should be. He always took that as evasion. Perhaps it was. But some truths are too large for ordinary conversation. And some people are unwilling to hear them anyway. The car slowed as we entered the private drive to the harbor residence the Navy maintained for my Charleston visits. As Harris opened my door, he hesitated. Ma'am, permission to speak freely. I stepped out. Granted. He looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. I reviewed local records after we left the restaurant. That got my attention. And that man, Derek Mercer. He's tied to an active financial inquiry involving Charleston redevelopment contracts. I studied him. How active? Preliminary federal review, fraud indicators. Interesting. Very interesting. Connected to Caleb. His expression told me enough before he answered. Yes, ma'am. For a moment I said nothing. Then I looked toward the dark harbor and felt something cold settle into place. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Recognition. The world often reveals character long before consequences arrive. Consequences simply make everyone else notice. I thanked Harris and went inside. An hour later, standing alone in the guest suite overlooking Charleston Harbor, I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Mother. 1 from Caleb. None from Father. I deleted them all unread. Then another message appeared. From an unknown number. You should have stayed quiet tonight. Some people don't like being embarrassed. No signature. No need for one. I smiled faintly. Derek had made his second mistake. And this one would be much harder to survive than the first. I slept well that night. That may sound strange considering the circumstances. A man had publicly humiliated me, threatened me afterward, and very likely tied himself to a growing federal investigation involving my own brother. Most people would have lain awake replaying every detail. But years in naval special warfare teach you something civilians often misunderstand. You sleep when sleep is available. Worry is not preparation. It is simply wasted energy. By 6 the next morning I was awake and standing barefoot on the harbor residence balcony watching Charleston come alive. Fishing boats moved slowly across the water. A church bell rang somewhere downtown. The air smelled of salt and magnolia blossoms. It was beautiful in the quiet way Charleston has always been, beautiful, polished, and dignified on the surface, full of old tensions underneath. Much like my family. I had just finished my second cup of coffee when my secure phone rang. Admiral Whitaker. Good morning, sir. You've made quite an impression back home. I could hear the dry humor in his voice. What's happened? The footage circulated faster than expected. That surprised me. Whitaker rarely sounded surprised himself, which made the statement significant. Public. Not yet, internal. That meant someone had shared it through official channels. The implications were immediate. Federal review was no longer theoretical. What's the status? The Department of Defense referred the incident to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service at 0600. DHS has also flagged Derek Mercer due to overlap with an ongoing financial corruption inquiry. I leaned against the balcony rail and stared out at the harbor. The machinery had begun moving. And once federal machinery starts, it develops a rhythm of its own. Slow at first. Then unstoppable. Does Mercer know? Not yet. He paused. Then, your brother may. That was interesting. How? His firm's records were subpoenaed 2 weeks ago under sealed review. I closed my eyes briefly. Caleb. Always clever enough to succeed quickly. Never wise enough to think beyond the next win. Our father loved that kind of ambition. He used to say Caleb had killer instinct, as though decency were some kind of professional handicap. Anything further required from me. No, continue as scheduled. That meant exactly what it sounded like. Remain visible. Attend the Veterans Legacy Gala in 1 week as planned. Maintain routine. Let events unfold. I understood. And because I understood, I asked no further questions. After the call ended, I dressed simply white blouse, navy slacks, low heels, and drove myself downtown. Sometimes before difficult things, I like to move through ordinary life. It reminds me what all the larger battles are supposedly protecting. Charleston was busy that morning. Tourists wandered Market Street carrying iced coffees and maps. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks. Old men argued cheerfully outside the corner cigar shop about college football predictions, as though national stability depended on them. America in all its ordinary grace. I stopped at a small bookstore I'd loved since childhood. The owner, Mrs. Talbot, looked up from behind the register and blinked. Abigail Reeves. Her smile spread instantly. Well, I'll be. I smiled back. She must have been nearly 80 now, though she carried herself with the same brisk energy I remembered from childhood visits. Good morning, Mrs. Talbot. She stepped around the counter and hugged me warmly. You're home. For a few days? She pulled back and studied my face carefully. Then her expression shifted. Something's wrong. Older people often notice what younger ones miss. Life sharpens that skill. It's manageable. She gave me the look only Southern women of a certain generation can produce, the one that communicates both affection and command. Sit. So I sat. And for the next 20 minutes she poured tea and reminded me of things I had forgotten. Like the summer I spent reading every naval history book in her shop because Father had grounded me after I announced my plans for Annapolis. Like how she had quietly slipped biographies of Admiral Grace Hopper and Rear Admiral Michelle Howard into my stack because she thought I needed examples, like how she had told me at 17. The world will always be threatened by a competent woman who does not require permission. I laughed softly, remembering it. Then she reached across the little cafe table and squeezed my hand. Your father still doesn't understand what he raised, does he? Number. Well, she said, her eyes brightening with familiar steel, he's overdue. By noon, my phone was vibrating constantly. Mother had called 6 times. Caleb twice. 1 voicemail from Father. I listened to his message while sitting in my car beneath a live oak dripping Spanish moss. His voice sounded controlled. Too controlled. Abigail. There appears to be some misunderstanding involving Caleb's firm and federal auditors. Caleb believes this may somehow connect to your incident last night. Call me immediately. Not concern for me. Concern for Caleb. Even now. I deleted the voicemail. Then another call came. This time from NCIS Special Agent Marcus Bell. I answered. Commander Reeves. Ma'am, I'm required to inform you that Mr. Mercer contacted several local associates this morning, attempting to obtain your classified service record. I went still. That changed things. Was he successful? No, ma'am. Good. Bell hesitated. Then, he also told one contact he planned to confront you publicly at the Veterans Legacy Gala. I smiled. Not because the threat amused me. Because Derek Mercer was still making mistakes, and he had no idea how expensive each one was becoming. Thank you, Agent Bell. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I looked toward Charleston Harbor again and thought, some storms announce themselves with thunder. Others arrive beneath clear skies. Derek Mercer still believed he was hunting prey. In exactly 6 days he would learn he had stepped into a battlefield he could not even see. And by then it would already be too late. The Veterans Legacy Gala had been a Charleston institution for nearly 40 years. My father used to donate every year. Not because he cared particularly deeply about veterans, but because attendance placed the Reeves name exactly where Charleston society believed it belonged, near polished silver expensive bourbon and people who measured human worth by lineage and seating arrangements. As a child, I had attended several of those dinners. I remembered chandeliers throwing warm light across white tablecloths, elderly men telling stories about Korea and Vietnam, women in elegant dresses speaking softly about duty and sacrifice. Back then, I thought patriotism looked like pressed tuxedos and crystal glasses. Later, I learned it usually looked like exhaustion grit and people quietly carrying burdens no one else would ever fully understand. That Saturday evening, I arrived through the side entrance reserved for official guests. I wore full navy dress whites. Not because I wanted to impress anyone. Because protocol required it. The uniform fit as naturally as my own skin after so many years. The gold shoulder boards, ribbons, and command insignia carried weight but not vanity. Each one represented responsibility. Each one remembered people who had paid more for service than I ever had. As I adjusted my cuffs in the preparation room, Admiral Whitaker entered. At 73, he still moved like a man accustomed to command. His silver hair was immaculate, his bearing straight enough to embarrass officers half his age. He looked me over and gave a small nod. Still impossible to intimidate, I see. I smiled. Years of practice, sir. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. NCIS made their arrests this afternoon. That stopped me. Arrests. 3 executives tied to Mercer Development, fraud, embezzlement, procurement violations. I processed that quickly. And Derek? Not yet. Whitaker's expression hardened. He insisted on attending tonight despite legal counsel advising otherwise. Of course he had. Men like Derek often confuse denial with strategy. He likely believed his usual charm would smooth everything over. He had no idea federal investigators were already seated inside. Caleb. Not charged. Yet. That single word hung between us unspoken. Whitaker studied me carefully. You understand what happens tonight changes your family permanently. I know. Any regrets? I thought of Father looking away as soup ran down my face. Of Mother's anxious silence. Of Caleb's smirk. And strangely, I felt no anger. Only sadness for all the years we might have spent differently. No regrets, I said. Whitaker nodded once. Then let's proceed. The ballroom was already full when we entered. Charleston's best and oldest money glittered beneath the chandeliers. Soft conversation filled the room. A string quartet played near the stage. And then I saw my family. Mother sat stiffly at table 12, her pearl necklace catching the light. Father wore his usual black tuxedo posture, immaculate expression, composed. Caleb leaned back comfortably, drink in hand, talking to Derek Mercer. Derek looked very pleased with himself. He was laughing. Then the announcer's voice filled the room. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise to welcome this year's Distinguished National Service honoree. The room quieted. I stepped forward beside Admiral Whitaker. The announcer continued. Recipient of the Silver Star Bronze Star with Valor and Current Strategic Operations, Commander for Naval Special Warfare. A murmur spread instantly. People began standing. Then came the final words. Commander Abigail Reeves. The room erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind born of genuine respect. Every eye turned toward me. And across that vast ballroom I saw my father's face lose all color. Mother's hand flew to her mouth. Caleb's drink froze halfway to his lips. And Derek looked as though someone had driven ice through his spine. His mouth actually fell open. I walked calmly toward the stage as senior officers rose and saluted. I returned each salute. No triumph. No performance. Simply acknowledgement. When I reached the podium, the applause slowly faded. I delivered the prepared remarks. Briefly. About service. About sacrifice. About the quiet strength of military families. About the debt we owe to those who carried impossible burdens without complaint. Then I stepped back. The audience rose again. And this time I saw my father standing too. Not because etiquette demanded it. Because his knees had nearly given way. After the ceremony, the room buzzed with astonishment. People approached from every direction. Old Charleston families who had barely acknowledged me for years now spoke with admiration. Retired officers offered handshakes. Younger service members introduced themselves with obvious pride. And through all of it, Derek stood frozen beside Caleb's table. Waiting. Finally, I walked toward them. Father rose first. His mouth opened, but no words came. Mother looked close to tears. Caleb's confidence had vanished entirely. And Derek was pale, sweating visibly. When I stopped before him, he swallowed hard. Commander, I didn't know. His voice shook. I looked at him steadily. No, I said, you didn't. He tried again. I'd like to apologize. For a long moment, no one spoke. The ballroom noise seemed to recede. Then I said calmly enough for all four of them to hear. "Mr. Mercer, when you poured soup over my head, your mistake was not failing to recognize my rank." His face twitched. "Your mistake was believing someone's worth depends on whether they can benefit you." The words landed harder than anger ever could have. His shoulders sagged. Behind him, federal agents had entered the room. And when Derek finally saw them approaching, he understood. The lesson had arrived. And there would be no walking away this time. The first thing Derek Mercer did when he saw the federal agents was glance at Caleb. It was a small movement, quick enough that most people in the ballroom would never have noticed. But years of command teach you to notice what men do in moments when instinct outruns performance. And in that brief, involuntary turn of his head, Derek revealed exactly where his fear was pointing. Toward my brother. Special Agent Marcus Bell approached with the calm, measured confidence federal investigators tend to develop after years of dealing with men who believe panic can somehow reverse facts. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, neat dark suit, no wasted motion. He gave me a polite nod first. "Commander Reeves." "Agent Bell." Then he turned to Derek. "Mr. Mercer, we need to speak with you regarding an ongoing federal investigation into procurement fraud, securities, misrepresentation, and conspiracy to obstruct financial review." Derek stared at him blankly for half a second. The human mind often grants itself one final instant of disbelief before reality settles in. Then his face collapsed. "This is a mistake." Bell's expression remained neutral. "It would be best if you cooperated." Around us, Charleston society had gone still. No one openly stared. Old Southern manners forbid obvious spectacle, but every eye was watching. Quietly, hungrily. The room had sensed blood. Derek's gaze darted again to Caleb. And this time my brother failed to hide his fear. His glass trembled visibly in his hand. Bell noticed. "Of course he did." "Mr. Reeves," he said evenly, "you'll likely be contacted shortly regarding related documentation requests." Caleb forced a smile. "I'm sure there's some misunderstanding." Bell's face did not change. "There often is." He placed a hand lightly on Derek's shoulder. "Come with us." Derek resisted for exactly 1 second. Then survival instinct overtook pride. As the agents escorted him across the ballroom, conversation slowly resumed in cautious murmurs. But no one returned to normal. The air had changed. Truth does that to a room. It alters the pressure. When the doors closed behind Derek and the agents, my mother exhaled sharply as though she had been holding her breath for hours. Father remained standing, staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not disappointment. Not judgment. Recognition. As though he were seeing his daughter for the first time. Caleb recovered first. He always had quick instincts when self-preservation was involved. He stepped toward me, lowering his voice. "Abigail, we need to talk privately." I regarded him for a moment, then nodded. We moved to a smaller side terrace overlooking the harbor. Charleston's humid night wrapped around us, warm and heavy. Inside, muted music drifted through the glass doors. For several seconds, Caleb said nothing. He was recalculating. That was his gift. And his curse. Finally, he turned to me, all polished concern. "You could help fix this." I almost smiled. There it was. Not apology. Not accountability. Strategy. How? "You clearly have influence here, connections. If this investigation escalated because of what happened at dinner..." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Surely you could clarify things. Explain Derek was drunk, that no offense was intended." I studied my younger brother. At 48, Caleb had our father's careful features softened by easier living. He had always been handsome in the way Charleston rewarded clean-cut, practiced ease, expensive confidence. People trusted him quickly. He had spent his life learning how to turn that trust into opportunity. And standing there beneath the terrace lights, asking me to save him from consequences he likely deserved, he looked suddenly very young. Almost frightened. "Did you know?" I asked. His eyes flickered. There it was again. The smallest betrayal. "Yes," he said quietly. "At first it seemed minor. Accounting shortcuts. Everyone does it. Then it got bigger." The honesty surprised me. Fear had finally stripped him down to something real. Why continue? He gave a humorless laugh. You know, Father. Yes. I did. Success had always been the family religion, and Caleb had been its chosen disciple. He needed to win, Caleb said, and eventually so did I. For the first time that evening, I felt true sorrow. Not for what Caleb had done, for how long he had mistaken approval for love. He looked at me desperately. Please, Abby. He hadn't called me that since childhood. Just tell them it was all exaggerated, that Mercer misunderstood who you were. I shook my head. Caleb, my rank does not protect me from consequences when I fail in duty. His face tightened. What does that have to do with this? Everything. I stepped closer, keeping my voice calm. If discipline applies only when convenient, it is not discipline at all. It is theater. He looked away, and suddenly I saw the exhaustion beneath his polished surface. Years spent performing success for a father whose approval could never truly be earned. Years of compromise disguised as ambition. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I thought if I became enough, he'd finally be proud. The words settled heavily between us. Because I understood them. I had built entire decades around that same impossible hope. And perhaps that was the saddest truth of all. Caleb and I had spent our lives chasing the same ghost in different ways. I placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. You cannot build a worthy life on borrowed admiration. His eyes filled unexpectedly. Then he nodded once. A small broken gesture. Inside the ballroom, applause suddenly erupted for some new announcement. Life continuing. As it always does. I turned back toward the doors. Behind me, Caleb remained motionless, staring out at the harbor, and perhaps for the first time in his life seeing clearly. Real revenge is rarely loud. It does not humiliate. It does not destroy for pleasure. It simply allows truth to arrive without interference. And when truth finally comes, dignity is often the sharpest blade of all. I did not hear from my father for 3 days. That in itself was unusual. William Reeves had built his life on control. Control of his business affairs. Control of his public image. Control of his home, his family, his expectations. Silence was not his preferred weapon. Correction was. Disappointment was. Measured disapproval delivered with such polished restraint that you often thanked him for it before realizing you had been wounded. As a child, I had spent years studying his moods the way sailors study weather, carefully, instinctively, always preparing for change. And so his silence unsettled me. Not because I feared it. Because I recognized what it usually meant. He was thinking. Really thinking. That Thursday afternoon, I was seated at the harbor residence dining table, reviewing classified briefing notes for my return flight to Washington, when Harris appeared quietly in the doorway. Ma'am. I looked up. Your father is here. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I closed the folder. Thank you, show him in. Harris nodded once and disappeared. A few seconds later, my father entered. He looked older than he had just 4 nights earlier. Not dramatically so. Age rarely announces itself in grand gestures. It reveals itself in subtler ways, the deeper line at the mouth, the slower rise from a chair, the heaviness around the eyes. He was wearing a navy sport coat and pressed khakis, his usual Charleston uniform of careful respectability. But his posture had changed. The certainty was gone. For the first time in my life, he looked unsure of himself. Abigail. His voice was steady. Barely. Father. I gestured toward the opposite chair. He sat. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Outside the windows, the harbor shimmered beneath soft afternoon light. A gull cried somewhere overhead. The world remained indifferent to human reckonings. Finally, he folded his hands carefully on the table. When your mother was pregnant with you, he said I was certain you'd be a boy. That was not what I expected. I said nothing. He gave a faint, brittle smile. I had plans for that boy. There was no cruelty in his tone. Only honesty. And somehow honesty hurts more. I imagined teaching him the business, watching him carry the family forward, showing him how a Reeves man behaves in Charleston. He looked down briefly. When you were born, I told myself it made no difference. A long pause. But it did. The words landed gently. And because they were gentle, they struck deep. He lifted his eyes to mine. You were bright, strong-willed, independent from the beginning, and instead of admiring those things—" His voice roughened. I resented them. I felt something tighten painfully in my chest. Not anger. Grief. For all the years lost to truths left unsaid. He continued quietly. Then Caleb was born, and he fit every expectation I understood. Easygoing, charming, eager to please. He gave a small broken laugh. So I convinced myself that was what strength looked like. Outside, a breeze stirred the harbor grass. Inside, my father's carefully ordered world was coming apart one sentence at a time. When you chose Annapolis, I was furious. I know. He nodded. No, you knew I was angry. You didn't know why. He drew a slow breath. I was afraid. That stopped me. He met my eyes directly now. Because the moment you left, I understood something I could not bear to admit. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. You had become braver than I had ever been. For several seconds I could not speak. The words struck somewhere deep and ancient inside me, the part of every daughter that waits however foolishly to hear her father finally tell the truth. He looked suddenly exhausted. I spent years pretending your life was lesser because admitting otherwise would mean confronting my own failures. A silence settled between us. Heavy. Necessary. Then, to my complete astonishment, my father's face crumpled. William Reeves did not cry. Not at his own father's funeral. Not when Mother nearly died during surgery 15 years earlier. Not when his business nearly collapsed in the recession. And yet now, sitting across from his daughter in the late afternoon light, tears spilled quietly down his face. I was proud of you, he said hoarsely. The words broke. He tried again. I was proud every day. His shoulders shook once. But I did not know how to say it without admitting how wrong I'd been. Something inside me gave way. Not shattered. Released. I had imagined this moment so many times over the years. Usually with triumph. Sometimes with bitterness. Never like this. Never with such profound sadness for what pride had stolen from us both. I reached across the table and covered his trembling hand with mine. His skin felt thinner than I remembered. Older. Real. I spent half my life trying to earn those words, I said softly. Fresh tears gathered in his eyes. I know. And eventually I continued. I joined the Navy because proving you wrong seemed easier than living small enough to make you comfortable. He closed his eyes. The truth hurt him. As it should. When he opened them again, there was no defensiveness left. Only regret. Can you forgive me? It is a strange thing, forgiveness. People imagine it arrives like lightning, sudden and dramatic. Usually it comes quietly like dawn. You look up one day and realize darkness has simply ended. I studied the man who had shaped so much of my life through absence, expectation, and silence. And I saw perhaps for the first time not my father the judge, but William, a flawed man who had inherited narrow ideas of strength and spent too long mistaking them for wisdom. Yes, I said. The word seemed to hollow him with relief. And for the first time since childhood, my father smiled at me without reservation. It was a small smile, but it was real. And sometimes the smallest truths heal the deepest wounds. 3 months later, we returned to the same restaurant. It was my father's idea. When he first suggested it, Mother looked as though he had proposed we dine in the middle of a hurricane. Even Caleb had gone pale. No one wanted to revisit the place where everything had broken open, which was precisely why my father insisted. Some things, he said quietly, must be faced where they began. And for once, no one argued with him. Charleston was cooler now. October had arrived with its soft southern mercy, easing the summer heat, and filling the city with that crisp salt air that always reminds me of football games, church suppers, and old evenings walking home beneath oak trees after dark. I had flown in from Washington that afternoon. Officially, I was there to deliver a lecture at the Citadel on strategic leadership and modern naval operations. Unofficially, I was there because family, if it is to survive, requires showing up. When I arrived at the restaurant just after 7, the same maitre d' greeted me. This time, his expression held visible respect. Commander Reeves, welcome back. Thank you. As he led me through the softly lit dining room, I noticed subtle glances from nearby tables. Recognition had spread after the gala. Charleston had learned who Abigail Reeves was. That no longer mattered much to me. What mattered sat waiting at the same corner table where my humiliation had once been served alongside tomato bisque. Mother rose first when she saw me. Her eyes filled instantly. She embraced me tightly longer than Southern form usually allows. "I'm so glad you came." "So am I." When she stepped back, Caleb offered a small, uncertain smile. He looked different. Lighter somehow. Federal prosecutors had negotiated a settlement in exchange for his cooperation against Mercer Development's larger corruption network. He had lost nearly everything financially. Oddly enough, it had made him gentler. Honest struggle often does. He now worked for a local non-profit restoring historic housing for veterans. Less glamorous. Far more real. "Good to see you, Abby." "You too." Then I turned to my father. And for a moment neither of us moved. He was dressed simply in a charcoal blazer. No performance, no social armor. Just William Reeves. Slowly he stood. Then awkwardly but with absolute sincerity he raised his right hand in salute. It was not regulation perfect. His elbow was too low. His fingers slightly off alignment. Years ago I might have corrected him automatically. Instead I felt my throat tighten. Because what mattered was not precision. It was meaning. This man who had once considered my service an embarrassment was honoring it the best way he knew how. And so I returned the salute. Perfectly. For one breathless second we simply stood there. Father and daughter. At last seeing each other clearly. Then his composure cracked. His eyes shone. And he laughed softly through the emotion. "Well," he said, lowering his hand, "I imagine yours looked better." I smiled. Years of practice. The others laughed too. And just like that, something old and wounded finally loosened its grip on all of us. Dinner was simple. Steak for Caleb. Sea bass for Mother. My father ordered soup, which made us all pause for half a second before he looked at me and said, "Well, I'm certainly not throwing it." The table erupted in genuine laughter. Even mine. Especially mine. And that perhaps was the clearest sign of healing. Later, over coffee and pecan pie, we spoke more honestly than we ever had. Mother admitted how often fear had kept her silent when she should have defended me. Caleb apologized without excuses. Not polished apology. Real apology. The kind that does not seek immediate absolution. And Father simply listened. Sometimes that is the greatest repentance a proud man can offer. When dinner ended, we stepped outside beneath Charleston's amber streetlights. The harbor breeze carried the scent of salt and magnolia. For a while no one spoke. Then Father looked at the dark water and said quietly, "I spent too many years believing strength meant control." He turned toward me. "You taught me it means truth." I looked at him, really looked at him, and understood something that had taken me 52 years to learn. Parents are often just children who grew older without healing properly. And if we are fortunate, life gives us one final chance to understand each other before time runs out. I placed my hand on his arm. "We both learned." He nodded. And that was enough. As I boarded my flight back to Washington the next morning, I thought about Derek Mercer. He had accepted a plea deal and was serving probation while completing mandatory veterans service outreach under court supervision. According to Caleb, the work was changing him. I hoped that was true. Because justice without growth is only punishment. And punishment alone teaches very little. If there is anything this story is worth remembering, perhaps it is this. People will often mistake silence for weakness. They will underestimate dignity because it does not shout. They will assume restraint means surrender. Let them. Truth does not need noise to prove itself. It only requires time. And when truth finally arrives, it speaks clearly enough for everyone willing to listen. If this story stirred something in your own heart, if it reminded you of someone who deserves forgiveness, or perhaps someone from whom forgiveness must still be asked, I hope you'll reflect on that tonight. And if these stories mean something to you, share them with someone who might need the reminder that grace is not weakness, and truth always finds its voice. Thank you for listening. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you know where to find us.